Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight live on the Liberty Hangout podcast. My name is James Chillemi. I am the co-founder of Liberty Hangout. For a quick announcement, we are proud to present two new domains for all of our technology and sports lovers out there, Tech Hangout and Sports Hangout. They will be available next week. If you're interested in giving your own 2 cents on the topics, please send me or Justin a message. Tonight, we are joined by two heavyweights in the realm of libertarian ideology. Arguing out of the yellow corner, he is the outspoken founder of the libertarian and pro-peaceful parenting community, the Voluntarist Initiative. He is also the author of the Mises Institute bestseller, The Spontaneous Order, A Capitalist Case for a Free Society. He will be representing the ideas of anarcho-capitalism. He is none other than our good friend, Chase Rachels. Chase, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. You do me too much honor here. Yes, I am the author of A Spontaneous Order. I'm also one of the founders of the Voluntarist Initiative, like James said. I've got a background as an intelligence analyst for the Air Force, which helped hasten my awakening to the errors of government in the military-industrial complex. So now I'm a proud, fully fledged voluntarist / anarcho-capitalist. And today I'll be discussing why I believe anarcho-capitalism is preferable to left-libertarianism.
And arguing out of the red corner, he is a graduate of the University of Maryland at College Park with a degree in politics, philosophy, and public policy. He is a known internet guru and social philosopher who has written for the Center for a Stateless Society. Tonight, he will be representing the ideas of left libertarianism, and his name is Alex Miller. Alex, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah. Hey, lived in Texas for a while, co-founded a group, an all-chapter alliance of the Libertarian Left outside Austin, which was actually a mix of like half ANCAP and half mutualist, but we all got along. It was a neat crowd. I considered myself ANCAP for many years, but I find a lot of value in left libertarian literature, and that's I think ANCAPs would find it valuable as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we're so glad to have you here. Just for the audience, tonight's debate format has been agreed upon by both contestants. It's going to start with a 10-minute opening statement from each person. There will then be 4 3-minute rapid-fire rebuttal rounds in which the debaters will attempt to draw blood from each other's ideology. And at the end of these rebuttal rounds, we will take a select number of questions from the audience, so make sure you're paying attention. Anything you have could appear on the show. And following that, I will give each contestant a 3-minute closing statement. Just for another housekeeping order, this sound is 30 seconds left in your round, so just know that you're facing the clock when that happens. So we're going to start with Chase. He'll be giving his promotion 10 minutes for anarcho-capitalism. Chase, take it away when you're ready.
Sure. So I'd like to start off by first defining my terms, anarcho-capitalism / libertarianism. Now, anarcho-capitalism is essentially grounded in 3 major components, the first of which is the private property ethic. And this states that all scarce goods, including land and the means of production, are subject to private ownership, given they are acquired via original appropriation / homesteading or voluntary exchange. That's for external goods. It also says that we are always the exclusive owners of our own physical bodies, and this is one ownership that's not transferable. You can't transfer ownership of your body to anyone else. And there's also the NAP, which is a derivative of these two, which simply states that all aggression is condemned as criminal and unjustified. And aggression is defined as the uninvited initiation of physical interference with the persons or property of others or threats thereof. Now, the whole purpose of this philosophy and the scope of political philosophy in general is ultimately about determining when it's justified to use force. That is to say, to determine who the aggressor or criminal and who the victim is in any sort of physical altercation between 2 people or their property. So this leads me into my critique of thickism, which is something that both left libertarians and alt-righters engage in, which I'm critical of. Thickism is basically the idea that we should be adding additional commitments to under the umbrella of libertarianism. Like, for instance, left libertarianism, they might say an opposition to racism or transphobia or homophobia or sexism, or opposition to wage labor or hierarchies or corporations. Like, these things, they say they should be part and parcel of libertarianism, either because they believe that they will help us achieve a libertarian society, or because the same reasons they're against these things is the same grounding as why they're for libertarianism, or that some of these things might be consequences of a libertarian society. But essentially what it comes down to is they are attempting to conflate the certain different values, their relations to libertarianism, and they're trying to merge that into an identity with libertarianism. And to me, I think that's a folly for two reasons. The first issue is if they're merely cultural, non-enforceable preferences, then they're falling outside the scope of what political philosophy is supposed to be about. They don't add anything to the question of when is it justified to use force. They might be noble and good causes. In fact, I share many of those positions against racism and homophobia and bigotry, whatever, but they just don't fall within the narrow scope of what libertarianism as a political legal philosophy is supposed to be about. So they're either irrelevant, or in the cases where some left libertarians think that they should be rights, like for instance, maybe someone should have a right not to be discriminated against, or just as an example, then what you do is when you elevate these things to the status of rights, then you're creating the potential for conflicts between different sets of rights. So using the racism example, let's say that you have a hotel owner who's a bigot who refuses to rent out a room to a black guy because he's black on the basis of his race. Well, you're in a situation now to where someone's rights are going to be violated no matter what. Either the black guy's rights to not be discriminated against, or the hotel owner's property rights, because you might force them to rent the room to the guy. So you put yourself in a position to where you have to determine what's the lesser of evils, or trying to balance these things. And this is the kind of things that happen when you don't properly compartmentalize different sets of values. Whereas ANCAPs, they keep the scope very narrow and focused on private property, NAP, and everything else beyond that is outside that scope. It might be compatible, but it doesn't mean it's part of it. Next, another big thing is the occupancy and use norms issue. Now, these are essentially limitations on private property over land. What they say is that you need to occupy your land at a certain arbitrary frequency or use it in a certain way, otherwise it would be considered abandoned. Basically, they're adding additional positive burdens on owners of land in order to retain their ownership. Whereas in reality, the only way land should be considered abandoned by an owner is if he explicitly revokes title to it, if he transfers it through sale, if he dies without a named heir, or if it's being given up as a form of restitution for some previously committed aggression. So someone for occupancy and use norms might be against landlord and lessee relationships. They would say that the tenants are the owners. Pretty much they collapse possession into ownership. They conflate the two. They don't really recognize the hard distinction that's supposed to be there. And this is anti-private property. This constitutes an abridgment to private property, which is of course the essence of libertarianism. So essentially it's anti-libertarianism, as far as I'm concerned. Then there's the opposition to capitalism the left libertarians have, and they have three different reasons they're against the term. They're either semantic or strategic or substantive. Semantic reasons might be they talk about what we have now as existing capitalism and they're critical of it. However, ironically, a lot of the actual elements they identify as they're against for this current economic system are actually statist and socialist elements, which are deviations from a pure capitalism. So to me, that's a very misleading way to go about it. And furthermore, they recognize the possibility of a stateless socialism, but they never seem to want to recognize the possibility of a stateless capitalism. In fact, their motto reads, free market, anti-capitalism. They don't understand that it's a spectrum. An economy can be on a spectrum between socialism and capitalism. Just because an economy is closer to the capitalist in the spectrum doesn't mean that everything in that economy is representative and falls under the capitalist model. Again, capitalism is simply the private ownership and the means of production. There are strategic issues, they say, too, that alienates too many people. It's too stigmatized. But then again, so is the word anarchism. Yet they don't have aversions to the word anarchism or leftism or even socialism, and these are at least as stigmatized as capitalism. And then finally, there's substantive disagreements, which will go to the more mutualist-leaning left libertarians who are favoring the occupancy and use norms, who are against landlord-leasee relationships or wage labor. And to be opposed to those from a principle basis is to be opposed to freedom of contract, which is, of course, an extension of property rights. So those oppositions, the substantive ones of capitalism, are actually deviation counter to libertarianism. They're incompatible with libertarianism. And I'll just end here by quoting from Dan Sanchez. He says, "Any concept can be thickened by blurring its boundaries and merging relations into identity with the concept. But the function of terms is to sharpen distinctions, not to blur them. A language with fewer distinctions is less, not more useful for theorizing and communicating. Blurring distinctions opens the door to sophistry, and sophistry opens the door to the state." And this is important because a lot of times left libertarians use a lot of very vague and obscure undefined terms like exploitation, solidarity, equality, things which can have multiple senses and meanings, and they use them more for their connotative effect, the way they evoke feelings as opposed to their denotative meanings, which leads people to be able to interpret them in many different ways, sometimes even mutually exclusive, which to me is a hindrance to clear communication and opens up to the door to equivocation and Mott and Bailey tactics. So I'll end there.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much, Chase, for that eloquent description. And I saw Alex's face shrivel up a couple times. So, Alex, your 10 minutes.
Cool. I'll put my timer on, too. All right. Cool. Well, I have no idea how I'm going to follow that. So I'll just liquid courage. All right. So, look, again, I want to say that, I'm not here to be the enemy of ANCAPs. Me personally, I'm someone who grew up from a Republican family. My introduction to libertarianism, if you call it that, was Ayn Rand, actually, and I got super into objectivism. Following that, it was Stefan Malnou for, again, years. I was very into Freedom and Radio, and considered myself ANCAP for years. I even found an old Bureaucrash Enjoy Capitalism shirt, and you can see it's quite worn, so I'm not bullshitting you. And I totally get the skepticism bordering on hostility, because to things described in leftist terminology, and I get that. I used to actually share that. So I guess I'll start with what is left libertarian. I'll probably spend the rest of the time just talking about what it is, since there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about that, especially based on some of the comments about this debate. So first off, okay, so what is left libertarianism? Well, first off, it is libertarianism. It is pro-individualism. It's pro what we can call private property rights, which I just define as a justified claim to an exclusive use of a piece of land or capital. Pro-market interaction. I don't know of any like syndicalists or even like communists within that camp, even though it is less, I guess, strict than NAP. They are anti-state, anti-authoritarian. So yeah, but there is this adjective left. So what's with that? I guess there's I broke down 4 main reasons as to why we use that qualifier to distinguish ourselves. One has to do with goals. So many are pursuing what they see as traditionally left goals, ranging from egalitarianism to gender equality, sexuality, sexual liberation, immigration, open borders, just being able to move with your feet, the freedom to move with your feet, and to some extent I'd even say environmentalism. A lot of these goals are either absent or explicitly rejected by certain ANCAP types. So whether it's Lou Rockwell or Hop, who are anti-open borders or anti-free immigration, or social conservative types like Walter Block, who I think said homosexuality was like a perversion or something like that, or Gary North, who likes libertarianism because it's like a means to achieve his goal of Christian Reconstructionism or whatever it's called, which I find pretty horrifying, and I think most folks will. There's a lot of libertarians who use libertarianism because they believe it's a means to achieve a form of tribalism, whether it's like these, quote, like national anarchists who share a lot in fly under ANCAP banners. Like I know Cody Wilson, who I have a lot of respect for, I recently heard he did an interview with some podcast or blog or whatever called Red Ice, and yeah, they were talking about libertarianism, private property rights, as a way to achieve these homogenized racial, Christian like groups, and because that'll be safer and everyone will be more happy or whatever. Like, no, some of us are libertarians because we believe it's the best way, market economic activity, rather than government mandate. We believe that's the best way to overcome these social problems. And let's be honest, anarchism is not utopia. Whoever says anarchism means there's never going to be a single economic social problem, I don't think Chase would say that. So anyway, and then not to mention the MRA libertarian types, so that tend to be more frequent under the NCAP banner than you don't really see many of them in the left libertarian. So goals. 2, and this probably is where we will focus most of our disagreement, the criteria for property. So while we do support what can be called private property rights, we are skeptical that they can be completely divorced from occupancy and use, which was the standard by which that justified claim was established. 2, although we believe in privatizing resources, we do have skepticism that certain natural resources can be fully privatized in an atomized fee-simple relationship, such as fisheries, rivers, etc. Then we can go into that. We'll probably go into that further. And number 3, it wasn't until I started reading left libertarian literature that the validity of collective homesteading and collective property was ever even talked about. I know ANCAPs that say that voluntary socialism is impossible. So I'll probably move on. We'll reserve one of my sections for probably specifically tackling those. So yes, while we do believe in private property, there are certain criteria, and that's probably where we differ some. Third reason that some folks use it is for historical reasons. I mean, you see a lot of ANCAPs and libertarians also refer to themselves as classic liberals. Like I'm thinking of, like Nick Gillespie is a popular one. He's not an ANCAP, but a lot of libertarians do. Now, even though liberal is almost ubiquitously used to represent some very anti-libertarian positions, but even despite that, because of the history, they were the original liberals. They stand for freedom. Pretty much what the word is supposed to mean. So we can sympathize with why they would call themselves as classic liberals. So if you think about it in that context, there are historical reasons for why folks in the left libertarian community use capitalism, socialism the way that they do. Socialism has a different meaning than what it did when it first came, as does capitalism. Briefly, socialism today is thought to be government control, lack of private property, and capitalism is the opposite. Private ownership of the means of production. Well, historically, the free marketers like Thomas Hodgkins, and there were a few others, hardcore free marketers, and you might even say faulty in certain economics. I mean, maybe, perhaps, but even Benjamin Tucker and some, they identified as socialists because capitalism was the state granting arbitrary border guidelines that other people could not homestead. The people were cut off from these resources arbitrarily, and so socialism originally, tied to labor, mixing labor with the soil, etc. So there's a bit more to it, but I find the semantics to be the most boring, and I don't know if we want to, skip over that, because I mean, if you want to call it, freedom, capitalism, that's fine. Like it doesn't matter, but there are historical reasons why some people don't, and you shouldn't write them off just because if you see that. I would recommend. It will further your worldly understanding. Fourth reason that the moniker left, the qualifier left is used, is indicative of strategy. Left libertarians generally oppose electoral politics as a way to advance a free society. And so even now we have ANCAPs, whether it's Walter Block, Stefan Molyneux, he's not an anarchist anymore. Anyway, but there are plenty out there who are voting for Trump or Gary Johnson or Ron Paul. So instead, left libertarians see ourselves as market actors who are going to engage in forms of direct action and counter-economics to directly change cultural norms. Strongly recommend anyone listen to Thaddeus Russell. He talks, I don't know if he calls himself left libertarian, but he talks a lot about the way to change even laws. Don't just go after the laws, change the culture. And eventually laws, catch up, as opposed to trying to participate in this rigged system. Similarly, Sheldon Richman's talked about this a lot as well. So, kind of four general reasons. Another last thing I'll say about left libertarianism isn't why it's called left libertarianism, but just one thing I find it valuable, the literature, as someone who could call himself an ANCAP. It talks about a lot of pitfalls that ANCAPs make. It's called vulgar libertarianism, and it's a lot of common mistakes that ANCAPs and libertarians use, where they think they're defending the free market, but they're really defending a very statist paradigm in the economic landscape we have now. So, anywho, I'll cut off there.
Okay. All right, perfect. Alex, thank you so much for that. We're going to start now, after a deep breath and a sip of whiskey, we're going to start now with the lightning rounds. We're going to get 4 3-minute rebuttal rounds. We're going to start with Chase and then head over to Alex. Chase, when you're ready.
Yeah, I'll try to hail the points as best I can. Alex mentioned about certain people in the movement who consider themselves to be ANCAPs, being opposed to things like gender equality and sexual liberation, things of that nature. This might be true, but just because some ANCAPs oppose these things doesn't mean opposition to these things is part of anarcho-capitalism philosophy. These are preferences and values they hold outside of their capacity as an ANCAP. Furthermore, for the same reason, being in favor of gender equality and sexual liberation would also be outside one's capacity as an ANCAP libertarian. These are things which should be compartmentalized in a separate realm of inquiry. Also, I'm not really sure how you would define gender equality or sexual liberation either. These are kind of very vague, obscure terms. MRA again. MRA, another thing, not in any way relevant to ANCAP as a philosophy. Or if someone is part of the MRA and an ANCAP, they aren't an MRA person in their capacity as an ANCAP. That's something separate from there. Of course, as ANCAPs, we believe the only legitimate rights are individual rights, which are essentially property rights, and no one has different sets of rights based on their gender or race, religion, etc. It's just about individual rights, right? As far as voluntary socialism is concerned, this does get kind of tricky. I think that voluntary socialism can at least be superficially emulated under an ANCAP overarching legal structure. If you define socialism as many people commonly owning the means of production. If people want to pool their property together and form communes and extend title to their property to everyone in the community, then that's going to be in effect effectively kind of a very socialist type of setup. But ironically, that would also be capitalism, because that's just them choosing what to do with their private property. They're just choosing to have many co-private partial owners of means of production. So it's kind of capitalism and socialism simultaneously, if that's how you define socialism. So to me, there's only two types of property, private and public. Private property is people who have property and they gained it through original appropriation, homesteading, or voluntary exchange. And public property is property acquired where people assert jurisdiction over it through who have acquired it through means other than those two. Okay. Finally, strategy and tactics have nothing to do with anarcho-capitalism. There's interesting things to talk about, but they don't fall inside the purview of libertarianism. I'm also an agorist. I also don't like using electoral politics, but my positions on those have nothing to do with my ANCAP position. Again, these are the same types of things you see left libertarians do. They conflate things outside the scope within libertarians. They don't understand how to compartmentalize tactics from the actual philosophy itself.
All right, perfect. Excellent. And now we're going to go over to our left libertarian ideologist and your rebuttal, sir.
All right, my friend. Cool. So yeah, the external commitments versus NAP only. So it's actually funny. I got Time magazine, and there's this article, Why We're Losing the Internet to Culture of Hate, and talks a lot about trolls. And anyway, there's one quote that I think is relevant here. It's by this some psychologist. She says, when people think it's increasingly okay to describe a group of people as subhuman or vermin, those same people are likely to think it's okay to hurt these people. So, what does this have to do with the NAP? Yeah, the NAP is great. I like it, and in terms of shorthand, it's great for describing. But why? What is it about the NAP that makes it valid? We have to consider those things, and when you fail to consider those things, it's it's easy to define even people outside of it. So I know that, Chase, you haven't mentioned it here, but I'm pretty sure you've mentioned before in some of our conversations that you've even defined, children outside of the NAP and the mentally challenged or even animals. Like the common reasoning was because, they can't engage in trade or contract or things like that. So similarly, when you have a dehumanizing philosophy of any sort, it is, while not directly entailed to the NAP, it is related because it can differ, it can change how you apply the NAP. So if you define low IQ people as outside of the standard rights, as, I've heard ANCAPs make that argument. The Reddit board is like drenched in racialism. You think about why is the NAP valid to begin with, and a lot of this is grounds. Like the NAP just doesn't come out of nowhere. It didn't come from God. We're both atheists, I think. Why is it valid? It's because, to a certain degree, equality. We call equality of authority, and again, can go into that. But in short, you don't have different moral rules for different folks. You don't have certain moral rules for black people, certain for white, certain moral rules for people on this continent, but different on another continent. You have the NAP is valid, individual rights are valid, and individual freedom is valid because it is an individual responsibility. So can you believe that in the NAP, but that some people are more inferior or have this collectivist outlook? Yeah, you can, but it's almost like, I don't know, like a performative contradiction, if you can call it that, to simultaneously support politics of individualism, the NAP, but a philosophy of collectivism, when it's a philosophy of individualism that justifies the NAP. Boom.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah. If just so you know, if Alex runs over, I'm willing to flex if he's in the middle of finishing a point. That's fine.
Alex, did you have another point you wanted to make?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, hopefully I extend the same respect or courtesy for that.
Yeah.
Well, the anarcho-capitalist extending an olive branch to the left libertarian. I like to see this. Right. This is great. All right, Chase, on you. 3 minutes. Let's go.
Okay, I think we're veering away from the left libertarianism for ANCAP topic with this, but now I'm kind of in the position to where I need to discuss moral agency. NAP, it isn't necessarily a human principle. It's something that applies, like you said, all rights apply to all moral agents equally. And justice has to do with maintaining a symmetric relationship with all beings. So as far as I'm concerned, with respect to, let's say, a bear, I have no rights. With respect to me, the bear has no rights. So that relationship is symmetrical. The reason this is because the bear doesn't have the capacity to deliberately recognize and deliberately respect my rights. Deliberately, not incidentally, but deliberately. He has no ability to conceptualize what rights are and therefore to respect them. So because of that, if I'm to try to if I'm trying to apply rights to the bear, then I'm putting the bear in a position of moral superiority to me, because I'm saying, hey, I've got to respect your rights, but you don't have to respect mine because you don't have even the capacity to respect mine. So that would be an asymmetrical relationship and unjust. Now, of course, there are some unsavory implications of this, and I never said children, but I have admitted that yes, technically, you know, most newborns wouldn't qualify for this moral agency threshold, and there could be even people severely retarded enough to where they couldn't either. But obviously, from a practical standpoint, most people have a vested interest in protecting their children, and of course there's all sorts of different communities and rules for being part of a community, which can include having certain sets of standards for behavior and treatment of children within there. So these are just technical issues that can be circumvented and addressed, because obviously proper treatment of newborns and mentally handicapped people is a very prevalent and valued system. So these are just the technical applications of rights. They're not necessarily human, and because of that, it is possible that it might be determined that a particular animal does have this capacity and should have rights applied to it. And for the same reason, when there's extraterrestrials that come here one day, we would show them rights because they meet this threshold. Rights aren't just limited to humans necessarily; they're for moral agents. And you're right; they universally apply. As far as people with lesser IQs in different races, even if that's true, they're not so lower IQ to where they fall below that threshold. I mean, we're talking about 3, 4, 5-year-olds are already passing this threshold, okay? So anyone who tries to argue black people or Muslims or whatever don't meet this, they're idiots. So that, and again, that has nothing to do with ANCAP. So I think that's where I'll stop. No, actually, no. What else did you talk about? Oh yeah, why isn't AP valid? Argumentation ethics, and I guess I'll have to talk about that next round. And that'll be
3 minutes. All right, and we're moving over to Alex. Alex, this is the last word, so please make it good.
Okay.
Oh, is this the 4th round already? I thought
that was the second.
Oh, I thought we were doing back and forth. Excuse me. Then we have 2 more rounds. Keep going.
Yeah.
You're all good.
Cool. Okay. I'll move on to something new. I'll talk about, I don't know that I can get occupancy news in 3 or 4 minutes. So let's go to a collective property. You talked about how you weren't sure how that could possibly happen if it weren't for kind of atomized fee simple owners kind of after the fact kind of coming together to determine that. And that's frankly what is taken for granted by most ANCAPs. I know that I did. It wasn't until I actually started reading certain left-libertarian literature that realized that it's very much not the case. So just as an individual can homestead, so can collectives. People as a group can mix their labor, break ground together, and it would be a collective system. And to then, for one individual to kind of enclose or privatize things like that, that would be violating the rights of the others who collectively work together for that common goal. And this was very, very common. I think Kropotkin, I think in one of his books, might have been, in Mutual Aid, pretty much goes through the history of almost on every continent. Every main group kind of went through this phase where they did the open village commune, the open village open field system. But even just to give a more recent example, so Roderick Long gave this example. So there's this town that lives close to a lake, and villagers go to this lake for the natural resources in this lake, fish, etc. So as individuals, they're kind of walking, and they kind of cut their path. And over time, not as the result of one person's labor, but of multiple, a path is finally cleared, and now there's a walkway that almost everyone uses when they go to this lake. Now, would an individual, could they homestead this, put up a toll, and then start charging admittance? No, that would not be justified or appropriate at all. So don't think of collective property is something that has to happen after the fact. It can be homestead that way as well. In 19th century England, it was very common for for the roads in towns to be public rights of way, and even when they weren't, there's actually a good record of them actually being gifted, for anyway. So yes, collective homesteading is definitely a valid concept. You can think of the Amish, you can think of Western settlements when folks were moving out west, you can think of the Mormon settlements, the Native Americans. So yeah, okay, I'll leave it at
Right on
that.
3 minutes. Right to chase.
All right. I'll go off of Alex's river trail example, since I think it'll be the best analogy to kind of illustrate this. That would be something what's known as common property, but essentially is unowned property. But what's happening is, like Alex said, people are no particular person can be identified as the person who really it's everyone walking through it every day to the lake and back, and they've all kind of used this. And this is a situation to where the demand for this resource has not exceeded its availability. And what happens in the future if someone wants to privatize that trail? And this isn't in any way conflicting with private property rights or privatization. If someone wants to privatize that trail in the future, what the case is that everyone who is walking that trail as part of that community or whatever, they still maintain an easement as far as their right of way. They still are, the easement is however they were using it before, they get to keep using it that way. And that's, so any sort of privatization will come about if the guy decided to start developing the trail, he took it upon himself to maintain it, and then he might be able to set rules as far as people who don't have these easement rights about coming in or not, or entering not, or whatever. But as long as these easement rights are respected by these people who've been using the trail, and maybe that would include them being able to invite people to come and etc., then that's perfectly fine. There's no conflict between something like this and private property. And there's also no conflict between private property and being able to have multiple private owners of a single resource or good. You can have, that's what a partnership is, that's what a corporation is, that's what a cooperative is. You have multiple private owners. They do, it's a partial ownership, but it's still a private ownership of a specific source. And this is in no way counter or conflicting with the private property ethic in any way whatsoever. It's perfectly compatible with ANCAP.
Okay, moving over to Alex.
Cool. I sense we're more just kind of bouncing back and forth. Yeah, I mean, so yes, it is private property in the sense that it's not, you know, a state or government property, but I don't conflate that distinction as the distinction of private or communal or collective property. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but it sounds strange, the idea that something that everyone worked toward, one person can then start issuing rules as to how it's used. That seems odd. I'm not sure that I follow. I can see how it is. There's some sense of being managed by the town as a whole, probably some process. Like again, if I don't know, they find that criminals or vagrants or thieves. Like I'm trying to think of what could possibly go wrong that that requires some attention. And I'm sure there'll be ways to deal with that, of course, but I don't see how one person can then start establishing rules that everyone else would have to go by. That sounds strange. I mean, maybe I can give it back to you if you want to.
Let me just stop here. This is getting into a kind of an esoteric field and kind of minutia, and I think we're kind of drifting away from the left-libertarian stuff. But if you are interested, there's a great article by Hoppe that talks about this very subject. It's called "Of Common, Public, and Private Property and the Rationale for Total Privatization." He explains this all intimately. It's really great because I've had similar concerns with these same types of issues. But let's try to shift gears and not lose the audience with this type of stuff, because I don't think we're really much at odds here. We're
actually gaining an audience as the episode progresses. So
okay, great. Well, as far as
so the lake would work like with a bunch of people. No, just kidding. Go ahead.
So anyways, as far as like public property is concerned, yeah, that's state property. Private property only means that there are owners and non-owners, that you can exclude others. It doesn't mean that there's only one owner if you're a private owner. It just means that there are others which aren't owners who you can exclude. That you have some exclusive access to this that other people don't have. That's all it means to be a private owner. That you are part of the people who have an exclusive right to utilize, occupy, or employ this resource in a certain way, as opposed to non-owners.
Right. But with collective property, you couldn't make that determination, those rules, as an individual. That would not be appropriate. For something that was collectively labored for, you might try to convince people and say, hey, there's a problem here, whatever it is, vagrants, migrants, crime, etc., and something to do about. And yeah, the town can then, again, in the case with this path, or their collective, food source, whatever it is, of course, they can exclude. I think where you lost me was when you made it sound like one person could do that. Now everyone else has to abide by it. That's where you lost me.
No,
I think we're on the same page now.
Yeah. Like you said, if there's multiple private owners to a specific resource, depending on what the setup's like, let's just say there are equal co-owners, equal co-private owners, then yeah, you're right. You can't have one single person making the policy, right?
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. That's perfectly compatible with private property ethic and stuff like that. That's what a partnership is, which is it's a private firm. I mean,
that's one form. Yeah. Cool.
So we've come to a kind of pass on the road here. Technically, you guys both have each one round left because you kind of went back and forth during 2 rounds in themselves. If you want to, if Chase wants to start off, and then we'll give it to Alex for 3 minutes.
Yeah, let me try to re-put this back on the left libertarian track. A big issue I have with a lot of left libertarians, again, it's trying to merge relations with identity. Trying to say because certain things are conducive to achieving libertarianism, or because certain tactics are conducive towards it, or because certain things might result from a libertarian society, then we should merge these things under the umbrella of libertarianism. And you can't, just because something's related to something doesn't mean it's part of it. It's a failure to compartmentalize. And furthermore, I have a big issue with utilizing a lot of terminology they do that they either are unwilling or unable to define clearly or concretely and coherently, or if they define with other vague terms, like, again, social justice. What exactly is that? I've never heard a clear definition of what libertarianism is in general. I hear 10 people give me 100 different definitions. What is exploitation? What exactly do you mean by sexual liberation and gender equality? I mean, these things, they do produce they evoke a very positive feeling in you or a negative feeling in you. They provoke feelings, but they don't really convey much discernible and distinguishable information, things that you can really critically evaluate. And I think because of that, it's almost on purpose, and because of that, it's a very fluid philosophy. It's very hard to critique and analyze, and it really enables them to engage in these Mott and Bailey tactics to where they say one thing, and you press them on it, and they act like it's something, like for instance, with capitalism. Say, hey, you're against capitalism, but that's just the private ownership that means production. Say, oh, no, I just don't think it's a good term because it alienates people, or because historically capitalism is X, Y, or Z. They don't go by the actual explicit economic definition of it, which can be evaluated and used, and they just go by some historical or social understanding. But if they're in a leftist environment, they can kind of leave it hanging out there. You know, it's like they're trying to ride both sides of the fence. And so there's a lot of equivocation. And to me, that's something that's very detrimental to communication. It really harms the integrity of the libertarian philosophy, and it causes a lot of confusion as opposed to clarity.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so there are folks who argue very poorly, and I would argue that's something in every movement. So you're kind of, the point again goes back to, what do these other things like gender equality, anti-homophobia, sexual liberation, what do these things have to do with the NAP? And I would say directly nothing. However, I think there are reasons for libertarians, as libertarians, to care about these things. If you believe that people should be free to pursue their own ends, but don't care when people don't feel free enough to actually express those desires and pursue those ends, yeah, you can technically have that outlook. That is weird. That seems weird to me. So I want people to be free to pursue their ends, and part of that is being able to get employment and not be mocked, vilified, ostracized for collective identities of things like race, gender, and sexual orientation. Recently, and again, this can tie into the NAP in terms of how you apply it. I mean, marital rape was not considered a thing until like the 90s or the late 80s, something like that. I think the last state that made marital rape an actual thing, and it's an actual crime, and it's because, again, it comes from collective cultural attitudes that hamper ability to engaging in the NAP. Be viewed as, oh, the wife broke a contract or whatever, like, because if she wasn't being available or what have you. I'm sure it was trolls, but I've heard people make these arguments. So directly entailed, but no. But I mean, to just say ANCAP is this, yeah, that's a political conclusion that comes from a philosophy of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And if you go through the grounds that work that justifies the NAP and property rights, it seems incompatible. Not that I'm elevating it to the status of rights, but the libertarian answer is no racism.
3 minutes.
Cool. Go ahead.
Go ahead, finish your point, Alex. That's fine.
Okay, thanks. So I agree with Sheldon Richman when he says the libertarian answer to racism is no, it's not okay. We should oppose that with all nonviolent means.
Great.
That's it. Cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, our audience has been following pretty steadfastly, and there are a few questions for you guys. The first one is for Chase, and it comes from follower Rachel16, and she wants to know, are you single?
No, I'm very happily married with a beautiful wife and mother of my child.
Perfect. And Alex, I have another question here.
Sure.
Someone in the audience wants to know, is that a cold room? Because it looks like a really cold room.
Yeah, so my house up just south of Baltimore is up for sale, and I have a baby and 2 German Shepherds, so
Awesome.
we're staying with my folks, and they keep the house very cold, so yeah.
Awesome. Okay, just to lighten the mood a little bit, now let's get back into it. The first question is for Chase. Is there a significant difference between an opt-in voluntary society and a third-party implicit contract?
Between a what?
A voluntary society
Okay.
and a third-party implicit contract. So I guess it's the social contract versus a voluntary society.
Third party yeah. You're only bound to terms that you explicitly agree to. The only time when you might be bound to certain like for instance, if you invite me to your house, you're taking an individual action. And some might say there might be some implicit guidelines that go with that, like you're not going to just murder me just because I enter your house, right? But nothing can be binding to you without you taking any individual action, whether that's explicitly agreeing to a contract or inviting someone in such a way that you're communicating clearly, even if not explicitly, but still clearly a certain default expectations. Like inviting me to the house doesn't mean you're inviting me to murder or rape me in there, you know? So no, social contract, that doesn't care what your individual actions are, doesn't care what contracts you individually sign. It says you're going to follow rules X, Y, and Z, and you're going to pay for them, and we can switch up the rules at our own discretion, regardless of what you want, and change the price for them whenever we want. and you're still going to have to be bound by it, and you can't hold us accountable for not meeting any sort of quantifiable, measurable standards. So now that's a categorically different thing than a voluntary society.
That makes sense. All right, so moving over to Alex. I've seen this littered throughout the thread tonight. People have been asking that and saying that they still don't know what left libertarianism is. So if you could give them, a 1, 2, 3 minute pitch on the exact definition of left libertarianism, what would it be?
Sorry, what was the time frame you wanted me to use on that?
Just as succinctly as you can put it.
Sure. So, okay. So left libertarianism, again, libertarianism because, they are pro-individualism, they're pro-markets, they're anti-state, etc. The left qualifier, again, can be for a few reasons, because it is a more of an umbrella term than, well, I'll say ANCAP, and I acknowledge that. So what these reasons tend to be, so you're aware, it could be, again, because of goals. Some folks are libertarians because they see it as a way to break down racial barriers, gender barriers, homosexuality, etc., which are goals that are sometimes explicitly rejected by certain ANCAPs, Block, North, Hop, Rockwell, etc. So two could be, again, criteria for property. Yeah, we believe in private property rights. You'll see this term called occupancy and use. I think it's perfectly compatible with ANCAP theory. We haven't gotten to that, and so if you want, we can talk about that. ANCAPs don't generally have a skepticism toward communal collective property, made a case for why we shouldn't have that skepticism and why it is different from government. Part of it is historical reason, same reason that people say they're classic liberals, because historically that was the original liberals, and terms like capitalism, socialism had a bit different historical meanings. So there's a historical reason. They think they're on a momentum of history that goes back longer than 20th century politics. And for strategy, tends to be anti-electoral politics. There are, even the ANCAP community is divided in terms of voting, etc., from Donald Trump or Gary Johnson, and left libertarians, agorists, mutualists, they tend to see themselves as market actors. Forget politics, do the direct action, change the culture yourself, work on counter economics, change the culture yourself. So, brief rundown, hopefully that was somewhat informative.
Okay, no, good answer. The next question comes from John F., and he wants to know, Chase, do children have rights in a free society?
Yes. I mean, short answer is yes. Because generally, children meet the threshold for moral agency. I mean, you learn very early on, very naturally as a kid, mine, yours, a conception of property rights, that people are that people.
We must have different babies.
People have the exclusive right to control their own body without aggressive interference. They understand that it's wrong to hit, steal, bite, whatever. This is something that you learn very early on. So yeah, the vast majority of children reach that threshold very early. Even those who don't reach that threshold, just because it's not a legal right technically, they don't meet that threshold, like when they're a newborn, it doesn't mean that there can't be many mechanisms in place in a voluntary society to prevent people from treating their babies in such a way. Like if you want to be a member of this community, you have to feed your child regularly and keep it in a safe environment, and you should subject yourself to verifying this every so often as a prerequisite to join the community. That's like an HOA. There's nothing contradicting something with that. There's nothing conflicting with that in like private property rights. That's totally compatible. And most people don't want to kill their children or starve them. Okay, so this is purely a technical, philosophical question. I know that people have a hard time separating their feelings from this idea, and it raises a lot of eyebrows. But you just have to think about it's all about maintaining that symmetrical legal relationship between different beings. You can't grant rights to something that doesn't even have the capacity to conceptualize your rights. It doesn't logically work out like that.
Okay. And I'm sorry, the next question comes from No, and he wants to know, Alex, should should Christian bakers be forced to bake gay wedding cakes?
course not.
Excellent. That worked out perfectly. Okay. So the last question we have is for both debaters.
Are we allowed to curse?
Yeah, go for it.
They're still shitheads, and as a libertarian with an individualistic philosophy that has brought me to my libertarian political conclusion, I think they're wrong, and so anyway.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
No, because there's been, again, littered through the thread, and I thought my favorite one, I forget who it was, but somebody had said that if you want to know what left libertarianism, just show them a picture of Gary Johnson. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, in terms of strategy, it's not generally how we jive. I mean, what do I think of Gary Johnson? Is that
what would be your response to that?
Was that for both of us?
Oh, I mean,
no, that was just for Alex. The question's coming later.
I mean, in terms of cultural trends, I'm glad that Gary Johnson is an interest. That gives me a little more hope than when I see all the people running to Trump. But to call him a left libertarian, I don't see how that goes by anything of what I've said so far. So
okay, perfect. Okay, so the last question is for both of you, and it has come from actually two people, and it's what good or service, if any, must be provided on a compulsory basis? And we'll start with Chase.
None. Zero.
Agreed. Yeah.
Give me softballs here, James.
No, that's what I'm saying. People have been asking it over and over again, and I'm just like, how does that? Dude, can't you tell the answer that's coming out?
Give me a good one.
All right, let's go with two more. I'll start with Alex. What do you mean by egalitarianism?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's a valid concept because it helps understand liberty. Like even when you think back to the Declaration of Independence, a very radical document at the time, all men created equal, for life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Equality is, we don't mean equality of outcome. We don't mean equality of socio-political status. We don't even mean equal opportunity. We think the market is the best way of getting towards those goals, but generally when folks use egalitarianism, like the French liberty, equality, and anyway, generally boils down to equality of authority, which does two things. One, it means that it destroys statism on its own, because you're not equal before the law, you will have to be also equal to the legislators, to the police, and so
we just got a breaking news, actually. A co-founder of mine, Justin, actually just text messaged me. He wants me to ask you, why do you believe that you have repeatedly said that you don't believe in compulsory use of the state to achieve egalitarianism? Many in your philosophy do. Why? Well, that's what I would. I'm not the one making the question, but I'm sure there are plenty of people that are confused maybe about your ideology or don't share it. Is that would you say that is fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I guess some of the questions, I know it's about Gary Johnson or baking the cake, or even some of the comments up before. I would say who. I'm not familiar with anyone who is using.
But it's just the same argument, because the same way you said that that ANCAPs will argue for state intervention and stuff like that, and I'm sure they would say, well, they're not real ANCAPs. So is that technically what you're saying, is that the left libertarians that identify with state compulsion are not actually left libertarian?
Yeah, the difference I would say is ANCAPs are more susceptible to some of these mishaps, because if they just go by the NAP, well, it's very easy to, again, define someone out of the NAP. Whereas, again, with if you incorporate a more robust philosophy behind it, which I think left libertarians do, that helps you avoid some of these pitfalls. I don't know anyone in the I can't think of anyone who would want to force like the bigoted baker to bake a cake for a gay wedding. I mean, I guess the one thing I will say is like in like redistribution, like I know that even I've said redistribution shouldn't be a dirty word for even ANCAPs because, as Carl Hess said, even though we purport private property rights, it doesn't mean that everything called private property right now we accept and we defend. You know, the state enriches some at the expense of others. You know, and I'm sure Chase and I agree on the vast majority of ways that that happens. So, so in terms of like some restitution, taking what you can get from the state, things like that.
Okay.
You're like, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay. No, that makes sense. Chase, moving over to you. We had a founding father question earlier about how the founding fathers had kind of went their ANCAP way, less state intrusion, less state impulsion in everybody's life. And they tried to whittle it down as much as possible. And we see now the gargantuan state that has accrued over 200 some odd years. What is it? What are the guards that are in place that are going to be better than the Montesquieuan checks and balances system, the limited government system? What can anarcho-capitalism offer that will guard against state monogamy more so than anything else?
Yeah, well, you see, there's an error with the premise of that question because the founding fathers never went in an ANCAP way; they went a minarchist way.
Right.
The minarchist way is simply reducing the cancer, not eliminating it. So when you never identify the core issue as being having a monopoly on the legal use of aggression, a monopoly on the creation, interpretation, enforcement of law and order, a monopoly to lay taxes and set prices for your services, the ability to be the ultimate arbiter in all conflicts, including those involving your own agents. I mean, these are all things that were never dealt away with, even when our government was at its smallest. And when you leave these powers intact, of course, inevitably, the state will grow. It will tax more. It will find a reason to increase the size of its security apparatus because there's no competition to it to temper its growth or behavior, or there's no threat to its revenue because it can tax. A moral hazard will manifest, and you'll continue to see services decline in quality and increase in costs, and you'll continue to find more manufactured crises that the state makes in order to justify expanding its jurisdictions and powers and revenue. So I mean,
okay,
because this is part of the cancer, right? So this cancer doesn't exist under anarcho-capitalism because there is no state. Everyone is competing in an open market. Everyone is held legally liable for their actions. No one has guaranteed tax revenue. No one has a monopoly on the creation, interpretation, and enforcement of law. And if you want to have a very detailed answer to this question, please look at my book. There's a free PDF of Mises, or purchase a copy. Read the Law and Order chapter or the Defense and Security chapter. It goes in detail about the mechanisms which will exist, which will not only prevent the state from manifesting, most likely, but shows why security and defense and law will be more just, more efficient, and a lot cheaper.
All right, awesome. Okay, so last question. Tonight we see a lot of the similarities between the two ideologies, while we saw the differences. If Alex, you had to pick out one facet of anarcho-capitalism that you find the most egregious, what would it be?
The most egregious.
I mean, I can go over to Chase first, and we come back to you if you want, because I'm asking him the same question.
Okay, I guess what I would say is, again, I grew frustrated with, because I was gonna say like misunderstanding of occupancy and use, but I did that for so long, it's understandable. It doesn't really bug me. I guess what really bugs me is when ANCAPs fail to see themselves as market actors. So, for example, I had a friend who we're talking about like Chick-fil-A and how they were anti-LGBT, and they're like, oh, I don't care. It's like, you know, it's not the state. It's just private people. It's like, but what I want to recognize is, again, anarchism is not meaning we've got to utopia. Being an anarcho-capitalist or a left-libertarian means that the freedom and market interaction are the best way to solve these problems because they're the most responsive to feedback. And not to mention they don't systematically built on violating rights. So remember that like we are market actors ourselves. So again, I wish there was less of a tolerance for the Jared Taylor who, like when he spoke at the Liberty Property and Freedom Society, like on race, like he's a race realist for those who don't know. I wish there was less of a tolerance for people who held collectivistic philosophies, but still, applied by the NAP. Like I get it, but I don't know. I still have a hard time calling them allies, and I grow frustrated with the tolerance toward it. Not that I'm arguing that they don't have those rights, but anyway.
Okay. And Chase, if you had to reiterate, if you had to name the most egregious facet of left libertarianism, what would it be to you?
Well, again, to me, it all boils down to the same stuff. It's the fuzzy, obscure communication with terms meant for connotation as opposed to denotation, evoking feelings as opposed to communicating concepts which can be critically evaluated and examined. It's perverting the integrity of the philosophy by trying to conflate many things that fall outside scope with it. It's also claiming that they're merely semantic differences, but at the same time smuggling in principles which are actually antithetical to private property, such as occupancy and use, and for some of them, opposition to wage labor, landlord-lessee arrangements, things of that nature. It's basically what I find to be a very insidious, but at the same time very effective tool to slowly pervert, obscure, and make fuzzy what the boundaries of libertarianism are supposed to be by appealing to people's emotional attachments and sometimes noble evaluations of other things, like being opposed to racism, homophobia, and stuff. I am opposed to all those things as well. I think they're, on a personal level, but by appealing to people's goodness and then trying to use that to get them to integrate things which don't have any relevance or even counter to the libertarianist philosophy with libertarianism I think is what made left libertarianism and leftist ideology a very real threat to our movement. Just as real, if not more serious than the alt-right. And for very similar reasons, ironically, except I think the right tends to be more explicit and overt about their intentions, whereas the left tend to kind of hide behind equivocation and sophistry and fuzzy terminology.
Okay. Now, Chase, is it fair to say that would be your closing statement? Is there anything else you want to add to the debate tonight?
Yeah, I just want to thank Alex for joining me tonight and having a very interesting, engaging discussion. It was challenging at times and very enlightening, and I hope that we can have something like this again in the future.
Awesome, awesome. Alex, I'll give you a closing statement just because I don't know if you wanted to end on something else.
Yeah, he should have the last word. That's good.
Cool. No, I also want to say thank you. This was fun. I haven't actually done anything like this in a bit, but no, it was fun. It was a challenge for sure. Yeah, it's interesting because there are things that were definitely left unsaid. We did not talk about occupancy and use, which I was really prepared for, but I almost shied away from because I feel like it would take me more than 3 or 4 minutes to like kind of get through it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll just say. Yeah, I'm glad we could do this. I would recommend that folks who even aren't familiar or who's skeptical read things like The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand. Read The Ethics of Labor Struggle. Sheldon Richman is an author. Highly recommend. Charles Johnson is a freaking like academic genius. I strongly recommend just check out some of these authors. I think what you'll find if you just like relax a little bit, and because the terminology can be startling at first, I get that, I really do, but I think what you'll find, what they're getting at, is not incompatible with a lot of the underlying values of anarcho-capitalism. I think they add to it, and I think they make it stronger. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And Alex, if our audience wants to find you, what's the best medium to do that?
Oh, I guess just Facebook. I had a YouTube a few years ago that I was keeping up with, but I haven't touched that in years. Just Facebook. Just hit me up if you ever want to chat. I'm happy to either chat with you, recommend resources.
Our audience is always open to chat, that's for sure. And Chase, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, of course. They could also go to my YouTube channel. It hasn't been active in a while, but there's still some good content on there. It's youtube.com/ancapchase. They can also find my book simply by doing an Amazon search for A Spontaneous Order. And if they want to get a free PDF copy, they can find that at Mises.org as well. And they can now find my book on Audible if they don't feel like reading. So it's in all formats, Kindle, Audible, or print, however they like it.
And I just want to thank you both for being here. I came out as a smarter libertarian today, listening to you guys for the last hour and 10 minutes. And hopefully we can do this again. And just thank you so much for being on Liberty Hangout.
Yay, thank you.
All right, and thank you so much for joining us tonight live on the Liberty Hangout podcast. Please be sure to give us a like on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and check out our website, libertyhangout.org, for more liberty-minded material, such as articles, editorials, and journal entries from a great lineup of writers, as well as videos, podcasts, and a libertarian memorabilia available exclusively in our website store. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm James Chalemi, and this is Liberty Hangout.